Good morning. Welcome to the Americanism Book Study. I'm Cody Leibold. This is the 7th of 9 meetings, and we're meeting Saturdays through December 18th, 2021. We're studying a new textbook of Americanism, The Politics of Ayn Rand. This week, the reading section was pages 105 through 124. You can go to christianintellectual.com/Americanism to get the replays of the previous videos or to sign up to join us on Zoom. We're discussing the unique set of ideas behind the original American way of government. The reading this week was from the section called Further Commentary by Ayn Rand, excerpts from Objectivist Workshop on Ethics and Politics. This section of the book deals with questions about how to apply the idea of a rights-based government to specific issues. Some likely topics I'll want to bring up from the reading include: is the consent of the governed the basis of government authority? What power do we delegate to a proper government? Is there a right to secede? Why should Americans reject the conception of a world government? International law and the, quote, laws of war. And finally, enforced vaccination and quarantine, a topic that is especially obvious and relevant today. All right, I'm going to jump into the section and I'm going to start highlighting some of the points that I think are most useful for our discussion today. So the first section is the consent of the governed the basis of governmental authority? And there's a couple different spots in this. It's on 105 that I'm reading right now, but also if you go back to page 81, there's a related question on that topic. So Rand would say no. She would say that the consent of the governed is not per se the basis of the government's authority. It's actually, there's a principle that is the basis. It's not what people say that's the basis. It's the principle that's the basis. So she argues that the basis for the government's authority is objective. It is the facts of man's life and what man's life requires. You could go back to page 81 and you'll see that there's a section that says, it is the principle of rights and not the mere will of the people that make a government legitimate. And the danger that she's trying to warn from here is somebody might say, oh, well, all of the people have agreed that we can have slavery, for example. We all voted on it and 51% of the people said yes to slavery. That would not make that kind of government legitimate. That's the point she's making. So she says, is the consent of the governed the basis of government authority? No. In that case, the base of government's authority would be that it was chosen or elected or sanctioned by the majority of the citizens. And if that is the source of the authority, it comes in principle to be a totalitarian government because all that would be necessary is that the majority chose it. Now, we see this in political discussions today frequently where people say, well, we're a democracy, and therefore whatever it was that the people chose or whatever it was that the people's leaders chose, that's just what's going to happen, as if there's no other consideration, if there's no limit on that. And the whole premise of this entire book is that there ought to be limits on the government. That is the individualistic approach to government, is that there are principled limits on what the government can do. So no, the government's authority does not derive merely from the consent of the governed. Although, if you read in I believe it's in the Declaration of Independence, there is a phrase to that end. So you have to understand what they meant when they said that phrase. And this is one of those situations where we're just going to say, we wish they said it differently in the Declaration. But we also agree with what they intended by that statement. And so Rand goes in and she explains her understanding of what the Declaration would have ought to have said and what is really intended by the wording there. So if you look at the bottom of page 105, she writes, or she says, because this is a recorded session, what is necessary for a government to be legitimate? A principle to justify it. And she goes on a little bit later, merely the fact that a number of people in a given geographical area wanted this government is no more valid than justifying an individual's action on the ground that he wanted it. Later she says, therefore, that the people want a certain government is not a validation at all. The Founding Fathers, who are the authors of that phrase, make it clear what they mean by the context. But out of context, the expression, quote, derives its just powers from the consent of the governed, is enormously dangerous. They defined what was the validation of a government and for what purpose a government is instituted. She goes on and she says, what do we mean when we say legitimate? Because you notice in that expression from the Founding Fathers derives its just powers. So they qualified it, and I think that that's the key to understanding how Rand and the Founding Fathers are not contradicting each other. It derives its just powers. So she says, what do we mean by legitimate? Morally and rationally justified. The Founding Fathers did state what principles justified the existence of a government. And the answer is to secure these rights. Governments are instituted among men. If you want to understand the Declaration of Independence, you are going to have to understand that phrase, to secure these rights. That's the key. Everything else will get mixed up in your understanding, and you're going to end up creating a different conception of government than the Founding Fathers had, unless you understand that phrase. So to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. In other words, the basic validation of a government is the kind of principle which serves as its fundamental guiding principle, writes Rand, and all its actions have to be derived from and consistent with the basic principle. And the only conceivable principle that can justify a government is the protection of individual rights. So that's her position on that. To validate that is the proper principle, one would have to ask, why is a government necessary at all? And she goes on to explain, just in the same way that you would ask yourself, why do we have ideas about right and wrong? Well, look at the needs of man's life. Look at the facts of reality which give rise to the need for the concepts that we have. She would say, well, the facts about man's life also indicate certain principles about what kind of government there must exist if there's going to be a society, and if there's going to be a society that recognizes and upholds the needs of man's life. So this whole section I found very useful for just unraveling what could potentially be a disagreement between what the Founding Fathers wrote, the consent of the governed, and the rights-based theory. There is no disagreement there. Unfortunately, the people today that are in government, the people that are teaching in the colleges, they don't understand this. Most lawyers don't understand this. Most lawyers don't even understand the concept of individual rights as being the principle, the basis on which we have a government. This is not the way most Americans think today, but it is the fundamental principle to Americanism, and it's the principle that we need to restore if we're going to have the kind of country that we once did, and if we're going to work toward the ideal, which is capitalism. You know, in Rand's, one of her books is called Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. And she points out that the idea of individual rights was present within the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution in the original way that the United States was created. But capitalism in practice has not fully come into existence. There were always things that were wrong with the way that the Founding Fathers ran things, including the fact that they accepted slavery, which is tragic. The fact that they had other economic policies that were incompatible with their ideas of individual rights. So, in today, it's just we followed a progression, sort of a slippery slope away from even that which they recognized at that time. We're getting further and further away from it. But the answer to move back to it is always to go back to this idea of, for the purpose of individual rights, governments are instituted among men. So she goes on and she says, now on that base, a government then derives, and observe what they said, its just powers from the consent of the governed. Now, they didn't say it derives its power from the consent or the desire or the whim of the governed. In other words, might does not make right, numbers do not make right. She says, no, only those of its powers which are just should be agreed to by the governed. When a government makes an unjust claim on unjust powers, then according to the extent of the breach, the governed have the right to disobey or to start a revolution. It is a logical principle which can be defended in reason and in morality. This serves as the basic source of a government's power. So, in other words, she thinks that the source of the government's power is a principle, not a person, not a group of people. This is a distinct idea. It's not common within the history of the world. She says, and such questions as how many people have to agree with this institution of a government in order for it to be valid do not enter, just as they don't enter into morality. If you're trying to decide what's right and wrong, you don't say, well, how many people agree with me? You give the principle. Now, she has a section here on page 107 where she deals with, without mentioning them by name, the critics that she had within the school of thought called anarcho-capitalism. And so there would be some people in the anarcho-capitalist school that would look at the American Founding Fathers and say, well, by what right do you have this ability to create a document that's going to cause me and my children and their children forever to have to live under this specific agreement. Like, they never signed it. And so this is one kind of objection. If you believe in anarchy, if you believe that there's some other kind of system than what the Founding Fathers created, the constitutional republic, if you think that there should not be a constitution that says, this is the power of the government and there should be a government and all these things, then you might be called an anarcho-capitalist. And you might say, well, by what right do you make me live in this kind of society? And Rand's answer to that is, well, the scope of the government that is created within this constitutional republic is such that the government itself does nothing to interfere with your life. So you don't have to sign this constitution personally. You don't have to agree to it intellectually. The point here is that we have agreed that the government will only respond with retaliatory force when there's an objective reason to believe that force has been initiated by somebody. So as long as you're living peacefully, this government is going to leave you alone, and you don't have to approve of it or disapprove of it. But in the event that you decide that you're going to go attack somebody, then the government is going to be the retaliatory agent. And if there had been no government, the individual that you initiated force against would be the retaliatory agent. But since there is a government, it's going to be it's going to be that government. And you can't really complain because the government is only doing that which the individuals had the right to do morally. The government is just creating a legal structure for preserving and justifying those individual rights. So I'll just read a little bit from that page 107. She says, did you ever realize that in a free society, we give dissenters their own choice? See, the dissenters are free too. If it's a free society, everyone's free. For instance, if a man says, I don't believe in respecting rights, I want to violate them, the answer of a proper kind of government is, go ahead and we will answer in kind. And they don't punish him until he has committed the act. But when he has violated somebody's rights, if he's robbed or killed or used force against someone, then the government is acting on his premises. So you want to act by force? Well, very well, that's your choice. We will act by force only toward you because that was your choice. In that sense, nothing is imposed on him. You see, she's answering the ANCAP objection there. All right, let's go to the next section there at the bottom of page 107. She asks, what power do we delegate to a proper government? What particular class of action? And the answer is the power to act as your own defender in cases where your rights have been violated. Then she asks, why is that necessary? For the sake of objectivity, so that men are not at the mercy of each other's irrationality or honest errors of knowledge. So you have to be able to show that your rights have been violated, and you have to make it an objective demonstration. So, for example, it's necessary if you're going to claim that somebody has stolen from you in a business relationship. It's necessary that you can show that you have a contract, that you have an agreement, so that you can show that the money that was taken was actually your money. Otherwise, how in the world is a judge supposed to look at your situation and give a ruling that is objective? And so she distinguishes, between what you may know if you were wronged versus what society itself can objectively determine about your case after the fact. And she says it's important that the evidence be objective, not just that your knowledge personally, but also that the evidence be objective. I think that that's on page 110 that she describes that. So she writes at the top of 108, in a proper society, a man does not resort to force if somebody attacks him by force or deprives him of property by force. Fraud is also in that same category. But then at the bottom of that page, she explains, well, in an emergency situation, sure, you would have the right to defend your life, perhaps even your house or your property in some situations, using lethal force. But if somebody steals from you and then the next day you go to their house and you use force to steal it back from them, that's a case of taking the law into your own hands, or vigilantism. And there's a huge danger in that, because how is society to judge whether or not you were the one that started it? So the principle that she offers is that you have to use contracts, you have to be careful who you associate with. You have to think ahead about the fact that if you are with this other person and they're a person of low character and there's no objective way to determine what was done to you, you're not going to have much of an ability to make claims against that person. This touches on the recent trend of Me Too, where somebody that is running for office suddenly hears from this person that they knew 25 or 30 years ago, oh, he did something bad to me, but I was the only one in the situation. No, there's no witnesses, there's no physical evidence. I didn't even tell anybody after the fact about the thing that happened. How is society supposed to judge between these two people? Because it's only word of mouth evidence. One person against one other person. How do you judge? So there's a need for objectivity. And it's for that reason that it's so important that if you are, in a dating relationship, that you be careful who you spend time alone with, because there is no way to objectively prove that something bad has taken place. At least in many situations, there's not. All right, let's go to, in this section, I wanted to mention that she brings up this case of someone trying to commit a vigilante act. And it reminds me a lot of what happened just this last couple of weeks. There was the trial of Ahmad Arbury, and there were 3 men who saw this man jogging through the neighborhood, and they thought that he looked like somebody that had recently been breaking into some houses. And so they said, well, we need to do a citizen's arrest on him. They had no objective evidence that he was the one, other than they thought that he resembled him. They chased him, they told him to stop, and then when he wouldn't stop, he was afraid, he ran, and they shot him. And he died. And now those 3 men are convicted of murder in the killing of Ahmad Arbery. And this is tragic, but it's exactly the situation that Rand is describing here. You cannot take justice into your own hands. I mean, these 3 men, even if for some reason they really, really thought for sure that this was the man who had been stealing, they did not have the right to perform a citizen's arrest because he was not in the act of stealing when they chased him down. Now, I don't even think that he was stealing. We don't have any proof that he was stealing. But whatever the case is, when they chose to try to perform a citizen's arrest, they tried to chase him down and point a gun at him. They were putting themselves in a situation where we as a society and the judge cannot look at that situation and say there is objective evidence that you were doing what needed to be done, that you had a right to do what you were doing there. And so Rand argues, so you thought someone stole your property. Maybe you were never anywhere near him, but for some irrational, dishonest, totally mistaken reason, let's say somebody thinks that you're guilty. Somebody marches into your house, starts grabbing your property as damages for what you allegedly stole from him, and then you call the police. And therefore, if he doesn't want to recognize an objective authority, he can try to act on that conviction if he wants to, but he is going to get the proper retaliation. And I believe that the case of these men that were guilty for killing Arbery, the retaliation is that they will spend the rest of their lives in jail. And that seems to be what we don't know for sure, whether or not there was any reason for them to suspect Arbery. But we do know that as far as the objective evidence, them being convicted of murder is the just outcome. All right, let's go to the bottom of page 109. This is a section called, When we enter into an organized society, do we lose the right objectively to defend ourselves? So this is sort of a related point to this vigilantism thing. And the answer is no, we don't lose the right, but we do delegate the right to defend ourselves so that, like I remember several years back, 6 years ago, my house was broken into. And like one very small personal item was stolen. We had the police officer come over and I'm not going to go walking through my neighborhood looking to see if somebody, looks guilty. I'm going to call the police. And, this whole situation of the police, it's interesting because the police can report, they can log, okay, a break-in happened and something was stolen. And if it turns up, then we'll return it to you. And actually a few weeks after that, the item turned up. And so we were able to get it back. And I went to the police station and got it. So that's the role that the police can have. But I remember when I was talking to the police that evening, he was in our house and we are like, so is there anything you can do? And they didn't really have a plan. Small thefts happen all the time. They can log it, but what can they really do? And it was at that point that I learned that the police officer's job is not necessarily to right the wrong after it's taken place. Their job is to just stop things in progress. If there's a criminal act in progress, or their job is to log the information so that later on, if there's a judge or if there's a situation where we need to unravel what actually happened, the police officer can be a witness. But then I did some reading about it and I realized the police officer's job is not even necessarily to put his life on the line to defend some innocent person. It's not necessarily his job to go out and stop the person who is committing the crime, or to prevent it, or to capture him afterward. That's not how his job is defined. He's a peace officer, so his job is to keep the peace. And in the case of when a crime has been committed, very often the role of the police officer is to keep the person who has had his right violated, to make sure that that person knows he's not allowed to go out and hunt down the other person. And I found that interesting, just to think about it. Like in principle, what is the police officer's job? And the police officer's job is to stop the force from continuing to be initiated. So that means that at least in our kind of society, a society where we have the right to bear arms, and a society where we have the right to defend ourselves, we ought to be the first line of defense, because the police take 8 or 15 or 20 minutes to get to your house if you call them. But your rights are ultimately your stewardship, and your life and your family's life is ultimately your stewardship. You must defend, but know very carefully, know ahead of time whether or not you are able to take this or that action legally to defend yourself, and know what's going to be the consequence if you take this or that action. For example, if you shot somebody in your house, do you have a legal defense fund ahead of time set up for that? If you shoot somebody outside of your house, a whole different legal situation. You have to be very cautious in today's society, because not only do we have the limits of objective evidence, but we also have corrupt judges, and we have situations like what happened with Kyle Rittenhouse, where the city and the population of that city and the mainstream media are going to pressure a jury to make an unjust decision. So I found Rand's discussion of this is illuminating. Let's go back to page 110. This is a summary of the ideas that we've just been describing. That which you know but cannot prove to others is not objective evidence, even though your knowledge is objective. All right, on the next page, 111, just one other point from her that I thought was helpful. She says, if you cannot prove it to others, you cannot demand that others comply with your judgment. So notice again and again, Rand points to this concept of objectivity. And objectivity, has different senses. But there's objectivity in your knowledge, there's objectivity in evidence, and then there's other forms as well, like, for example, journalistic objectivity and objectivity in communication. There's lots of material in the objectivist corpus if you're interested to learn more about those things. All right, let's go to page 112. This is where she summarized this idea that you really do need receipts in a just society, in a society that recognizes individual rights. If you purchase something, you need the receipt in order to demonstrate that you did purchase it. If you make a contract with somebody, it has to be clear. So she says, you must be very sure not to put yourself in positions where you can be cheated or wronged or defrauded and not able to prove it. So it's your responsibility when you get into these situations to think ahead about, am I going to be defrauded? I can share a little bit about an experience I had like that, where I did some work for somebody, and then I sent them the invoice and they didn't pay it. And this was I think it was maybe $600 outstanding or something like that. And it might have been $1,000, I don't remember. But whatever it was, I messaged them, and a few weeks later I messaged them again. A few weeks later, a month went by, 2 months, 3 months. I was like, am I never going to get my money? And this whole situation taught me something, which is that, if you go into any agreement with somebody, first of all, know whether they're an honest person. And if you don't really, really know it, why would you get into the agreement? Protect yourself. Collect the payment up front if you're a private contractor. And think ahead of time about if you need a contract. The contract can defend you from a whole bunch of things. One, it can defend you against the situation where somebody doesn't pay, and then maybe you need to take them to court, which I did not do, but you could. A different situation is, what if you need to protect yourself against the accusation that you didn't do the work? So you need to make sure that, if you're a contractor, that you outlined what the exhortation was, and what is the situation where the job has been done and it has been approved. There's a timeline in place, and so that way you can demonstrate that you at least took steps ahead of time. You could show that to a court and say, well, here's the report of what I did, and here's the agreement that we made, and here we have, both of us signed it. Just keep receipts. All right, Rand talks on page 113 about this idea of the need for physical evidence. And I'm going to skip ahead. So let's go to page 114. She talks about, is there a right to secede? So sort of a subject change here. But she's talking in, I think it was 1970s when she recorded this. And so in the situation that she was describing the United States was still, for the most part, a society that upheld individual rights. It's important to recognize. And so, especially compared to other governments in the world at the time, the United States was a beacon. Even though it had been falling into corruption, it was still so much better than the alternative, say the Soviet Union. And so here's her answer. If there is a free government, that is a government based on the recognition and protection of individual rights, on what grounds would a group of people want to secede? There wouldn't be an objective basis for seceding, at least in the 1970s, from the United States. Now then, she says, well, there might be a situation where there's just such a disagreement about some issue that some of the states decide they want to peacefully secede, not to engage in war, but to talk to the other states and say, we believe there's a reason why we should secede. And she says, if the individual states, or if there was a geographical area that could, on the basis of reason and consent, argue that secession is a good idea, then there's nothing to stop that. There's no reason why that would be wrong. But then she gets to this question of, okay, so what about when you live in a society that is not defending individual rights? Now, make a distinction between application versus principle. There's been no society in all of history that has, in all matters of application, defended all individual rights. That's not the standard. But what about, does the government in principle recognize that its role is to defend individual rights? Rand discusses that. She says, when a government isn't on the premise of defending rights, if it's on the premise of the collective good, or I'm sorry, the public good, the social welfare, then anybody has the right to secede. Then it is only an issue of, can you get away with it? And then she says a couple sentences later, if the parent government doesn't recognize rights, if it has no authority, no moral legitimate authority, and then the right is with anyone who wants to object. So the right to secede does not require that you have a certain number of people. But the practical nature of seceding does require that you have a certain number of people and that you have a certain amount of might. You could compare the question of George Washington and the American Revolution to today, and you can say that all of the things that the government does against its own people today are so much worse than anything that King George of England did. But the situation is quite a bit different in that today there's not the geographical isolation that America had from England. There's just so much of a difference in the amount of power that the U.S. government has over its people right now, that secession is just not a reasonable option unless it were done by consent. And I mean, I just want to remind you, everything that we do at ChristianIntellectual.com is in light of this possibility that if we don't have a cultural revolution soon, a cultural revolution toward individual rights and capitalism and freedom, what's going to end up happening is there will be rebellions. We're not going to be part of those rebellions, but we think that those rebellions are a horrible outcome. It's a possibility that there could be a civil war in the United States, and we're trying to avert that. We don't support that, but we think that the best way to avert that outcome is to teach people how to reform the government peacefully. All right, let's go to page 116. Should Americans reject the conception of a world government? And Rand says yes on the grounds of checks and balances. I think this is a pretty obvious point, but she says it well. On the grounds that since a government it has a very dangerous kind of monopoly, the monopoly on the principle of force and administering the use of physical force. Just project the consequences, she writes on page 117. If there were only one government in the world, then it's a monopoly on the use of force. Well, suppose a government controls the nuclear arsenal of the world. What do any dissenters do? And who can effectively prevent such a government from turning into a total dictatorship? And then she projects, like, what kind of situation would somebody argue, well, we need a one world government? And she says, yeah, but if it were that bad, if the situation were really that bad that we need a one world government, she says it's going to be a bad one. If people are disunited to that extent, and all are in effect broken up into different gangs nationally or geographically, racially, etc., uniting them under one government is going to aggravate things. It will lead only to a state of civil war. And then at the end of that section, she says very powerfully, man is not omnipotent and omniscient, so save us from one authority. Sometimes Rand says things, and I think to myself, your idioms of speech come from a Christian era. Save us from one authority. God is the actual complete sentence, and that's what we at For the New Christian Intellectual are praying, that God would save us from this one world government that is obviously in the works. All right, so let's go to page 119. There's a section here where she just talks about what about this issue of international law and the, quote, laws of war. And she points out there really isn't such a thing. Like, in a state of war, people do what is necessary to win. And she advocates for the use of extreme measures in order to defeat the aggressor in a war. And that's a topic that I've discussed with people online, and there's been a lot of disagreement about it. But, in the case of confronting, for example, radical Islamic terrorists, or in the case of confronting nations that are intentionally provoking the United States, the position that Ayn Rand had and that other objectivists have today is that you should go to the heart of the enemy's power and you should destroy it. You should destroy their willingness to fight. So, there's this book by John David Lewis called Nothing Less Than Victory. And it gives an account of how various major wars in history began and then how they were ended eventually. And when they were ended, what it took to end them. And, so situations that come up in that book are the World War II, the American Civil War, the Revolutionary War, the Peloponnesian War, the war with Persia and the Greeks. I forget the name of that one. The situation, or the principle that John David Lewis points out there, is that war will always continue coming at you until you end the willingness of your enemy to fight. You could defeat your enemy, but then 20 years later, the next generation will want that war again, unless you make an end of their desire to fight. So it's one of my favorite books, and it's one that I'd like to do a book study on maybe in about 2 years from now or something like that. And this situation, it's true for our foreign policy as a country. We have to recognize that other nations are going to try to destroy us, and that we have to destroy their willingness to fight, which means we have to take out their capacity to make war, and we have to destroy their willingness to make war, which means perhaps the psychological aspect of warfare is just as important as the physical. So that's true in that sphere of actual world wars, but it's also true in the culture war. This principle is that we're going to continue having a culture war, a civil culture war in the United States, until we destroy the willingness of the radical left to continue engaging in this war. We have to figure out what it is that they own that is the source of their power and that is causing them to continue to grow back like a virus. And the answer is obvious. It's the culture generating institutions, including the school system, the public school system. What's the point of trying to get somebody elected into power unless once they are elected into power, their goal is going to be to abolish the public school system, to abolish the university systems. That's what we need in this country. We need those systems to be turned over to private enterprise. And other institutions as well, obviously, need to be taken back. The seminaries and churches and the mainstream media are, I would say, the main culture makers, the publishing industry. These kinds of institutions are creating the poison. And so, I don't know, that I bring that up just as a sidebar, that we have to be willing to take strong measures to defeat those who are making war against us. Otherwise, that war is going to continue forever. One of the premises that Rand has, and I agree with it, it's on 119. She just points out that The people that begin wars, the people that initiate wars, they are always the ones that desire to make slaves of people. The freer nations historically have hardly ever been the aggressors. It is the nations that enslave their own people that seek to go and enslave other people. You can see that in Germany, for instance. I mean, that's the most obvious example, because you have the Holocaust. You have the German government committing horrible crimes against its own people, and also saying things to its people like, every nation in history is either going to be the anvil or the hammer, and it's about time that we be the hammer. And they're going to go and subdue the other nations and take their wealth from them. That's their explicitly stated goal. There's a connection there between, the kind of leader that wants to do that to other people and that wants to do it to his own people. And very often, trying to subdue other people is actually a means of distracting the citizens from what you're doing to them as well. Let's look in the most recent United States history and see if that's true. Is it who are the presidents that are going out and starting wars? Who are the presidents that are going and attempting to make peace? The political situation under Barack Obama and under Joe Biden has been escalating of tensions internationally. The political situation under the Republican President Trump was de-escalation, and ISIS became less powerful under his leadership. And just it's interesting to see that the people that want to control more of the economy and that want to dictate at home, they tend to escalate. For whatever reason, they tend to escalate abroad as well. And there's different things that they have done. Like, for example, I remember about a year and a half ago, Trump sent a missile and killed one of the Iranian generals, I believe. That's the kind of thing that had a tendency to de-escalate war. It's interesting. There's certain actions that you could take that are using violence, but that tend to de-escalate rather than escalate. Whereas the policies of the Democrats have again and again created disasters. I mean, if you just look at the Afghanistan withdrawal, like, this is a situation where he was trying to be peaceful. It's almost like the opposite personality and mindset of Donald Trump, where Biden doesn't want to be shooting the bad guys with missiles. He wants to withdraw. He wants to put an end to 20 years of war. But the way he does it ends up creating a destabilization of the region. And anyway, so I think that's maybe enough on foreign policy, because that's not the main issue of this chapter. But the principle that Rand summarizes is, she says, the total annihilation of the aggressor is proper. It's the proper goal, except for the fact that you have to be sure that you're not the one at fault, which is sometimes the case. And then she says, but in most wars, it's always the more controlled country that attacks the freer. The next section, she asks, are laws which anticipate violence proper? And it's an interesting section here. She talks about whether creating a picket line to protest if you are on strike, if that would be appropriate. And she says, well, I mean, maybe morally you might have the right to do it, but legally you're crossing into a gray area here, because if you create a line of people and you don't let other workers come in order to break your strike, then you are trespassing on somebody else's property. And she says it technically, there's nothing to say that the owner of that land and that company couldn't hire some people to come and push you out. So she points out that you don't really have a right to use force in order to appeal to public opinion. And it's not even that helpful, because if you were to do that, how are you going to inform the public by such a means? They're not going to hear the actual story. They're just going to hear emotional appeals and, it's bad. And that's not an objective reason for why anybody should do anything. Going to the next page, 120. She also connects that idea of you shouldn't be making a picket line to you don't have the right to obstruct public thoroughfares. People that protest by laying down on the highway, you do not have a right to do that. And this, for some people that are libertarians or some people that are just not very well versed in political thought, this might be a source of some mystery. Like, well, if you believed in a society based on individual rights, and there was no public property, then why couldn't somebody just like buy up all the land surrounding your house and make you forever stuck in your own property? People ask things like that. And the answer is, well, obviously you have a right to transit in a free society. And there will be means by which we will create that, and we'll preserve that right to transit. So Rand says there has to be an actual right to use public thoroughfares and access to those thoroughfares, because that's what they're for. If somebody then decides to block the public's interest in something, he's violating the right of anyone who wants to come into that business, and he's violating the right of the business. She suggests if somebody really wants to picket, you might have the right to stand by the door and distribute pamphlets or to get on the radio or something like that. This last section in our reading today is called Enforced Vaccination and Quarantine. So this is particularly relevant, obviously. I'll try to say things that are not going to bring any YouTube bans or anything, but it might be difficult. So this is the bottom of 120. The government does not have the right to force vaccines. Those who don't want to be vaccinated will pay the penalty. Those who want to are perfectly safe. Now, she's operating on the premise that vaccines are actually vaccines. This was in the days when the word vaccine meant vaccine, right? So her point there is that if you force other people to take vaccines, well, that's not even going to help the people that already chose to have the vaccines. So it's not any of their business. But her overall goal is that the government does not have the right to force vaccines. Now, on the topic of quarantine, does the government have the right? She uses the word right. Does the government have the right? That might not be the most precise way to explain what the government can do, but you understand the point. She says, quarantine, yes, when it's demonstrated that the person does pass the disease to others. Ask yourself whose right is being infringed. If a typhoid Mary is a transmitter of a disease, everybody can't hide from her and let her walk around free, then she has to withdraw. And if she doesn't want to, then the government has the right to take her into custody or put her into a contagious disease hospital for the duration. So yes, if you can demonstrate that somebody is a danger to others just by even walking around in public, and then they choose to walk around in public, yes, you could make a case that there should be a quarantine if that were happening. But that's a whole different situation than what I understand from what's going on during the COVID restrictions, where people that have not been shown to have the disease are being told you must lock down. Different countries have different policies, but the point is, if you can't show that the person has the disease, by what right can the government tell them to lock down or to shelter in place? She goes on, but vaccination is something else, because in the case of vaccination, everybody who agrees with the necessity would have the shot. Those who don't want it would pay the penalty, meaning they would potentially get the disease. But the danger of enforced vaccination is dubious scientific theory. Now, she has this whole section here about dubious scientific theory and why it's almost impossible for a government to determine scientific facts about whether or not there is, a disease and what needs to be done about it. And it's funny because, yeah, that's what we've seen in the last 18 months in the United States right now. Then she goes on and she mentions the case of, well, what about children? Could the government mandate that children receive the vaccine? Because, like, what if the parents are just dumb or, recalcitrant? And what if the children really need the vaccine? And she argues, no, unless you had just the ability to prove that without this vaccine, the kids are going to die, and unless it's really known that this is necessary for their survival, you can't say, it's child abuse to not give the kids the vaccines. And so the government has to step in and take the kids and vaccinate them against the will of the parents. So that's interesting. Just kind of working out the application here. So she just says, in practice, I just do not think it could be demonstrated that there's a situation where a vaccine is so necessary that the government should forcibly administer it to children. She says, if it is only a probability, then you can't use force. If it's only a probability, then it's the parent's judgment whether to vaccinate. And I mean, if you try to look at the situation we have today, like, very, very few children are in danger from the COVID virus. So it's not even a question at this point whether or not the government has a right to forcibly vaccinate children. She transitions in this section at the bottom of page 122 to the question of treatment of children. I think this is just a free-flowing conversation, and there's some ellipses and stuff in the conversation. But the point that she's making here is about whether or not it is child abuse to not educate your children, and whether or not the government has any role in educating children. This is just I think it's an interesting thought experiment, because we're not in a situation today where we really have we're not facing this issue. But in a free society where there's no public schools, and where private schools cost money, and where some people are poor and they can't send their children to school, what are you going to do? What are you going to do if the parent says, I'm just not going to send my kid to school? Kind of interesting question, right? So she writes, if a parent doesn't want to teach his child to read or write, that's too bad. But the parent has that right until the child is old enough to go out on his own, or to go on his own to school, because you cannot establish by force pedagogical ideas. Even if you have the most brilliant, most intelligent man in the world, and 99%, 100% likely to be right, you cannot enforce ideas. This is why the government should be out of the field of schools as fast as possible. And she goes on, even if a parent systematically teaches a child that A is non-A, the government should not interfere if a child is being miseducated. And this applies to the religious freedom issue. Like, for example, I don't believe in Mormonism, but I'm not going to use the government to prohibit parents from teaching Mormonism to their children, even though I think that amounts to teaching them that A is non-A, and that's bad. I'm not going to say that it amounts to legal child abuse. And the reason why I draw the line there is because, what somebody teaches their children, that's not something that makes objectively demonstrable damage to the person. The child has the ability to think. They have the ability to reason through and realize, I'm being fed lies. It's not the same thing as if the child goes up to a police officer and he has a black eye and he says, my dad did this to me. You need objective physical evidence if you're going to demonstrate abuse. So this is interesting. The flow of this chapter kind of goes into how do you demonstrate abuse, and how do you make sure that's objective. And then that even gets into the question of spousal abuse. How would a wife demonstrate that she had been abused by her husband? And it's the same principle. It needs to be physical damage. Otherwise, you can't really make a legal case that somebody has violated your rights. So that's over on page 122. Now, I think it's interesting to compare this section to what I heard in Leonard Peikoff's podcast when I listened through the whole thing a couple years back. Leonard Peikoff, I think he elaborated on this question of the education of children. And he pointed out that, at least in his view, to rightfully understand the principle of individual rights and how it applies to the education of children, in a free society, there would be some minimal level of standards that the government could say, you have to teach by the age of, say, 7 or 8 or 9. You have to teach your kids the names of the letters and how to do math problems up to 100, and how to do basic reading and phonics. And if if it's shown that you're not doing that, then we could make a case that it's child abuse. So we're not talking about the government taking control of the overall education, but we are saying that there are minimum standards that children will have to meet. And if not, then maybe it's a special needs case. But if it's not a special needs case, then there can be a mandate for you must put your kid in school or pay a fine. And if it's a free society, how are we going to find somebody to educate the child? Like, who's going to pay for it? And I believe that the answer could be, well, there could be charities that would make it possible. The Catholic Church has always had schools that are available like that. Then, and also with the age of the internet, it's hard to imagine a situation where a child couldn't access at least enough to learn how to read the basics using YouTube or public libraries. Well, but we don't have public libraries. Oh, so what do we do? Well, imagine if there were private libraries. That's what would be if there were a free society. I mean, who built the libraries in the first place? Do you think it was the government? For the most part, it was the industrialists, the philanthropists. Anyway, so that's a whole bunch of, this is a chapter of rabbit trails in a way, but it's illuminating to see how much common sense just dictates the approach of objectivism to applying things like this. Like, Rand answers the question of thoroughfares, and she says, well, of course people have the right to use thoroughfares because that's what they're for. This is not a sophisticated philosophical argument, but for such matters, a sophisticated argument is hardly necessary. You're just talking to people who have these really dumb objections. And I mean, if you wanted to flesh out the application of each one of these points in a lot more detail, you could. But this gives you a direction to follow, and it shows that it is consistent with the overall approach to individual rights, that you could have good solutions to the question of thoroughfares, to the question of vaccines, quarantines, the education of children, the question of whether or not a woman can claim that she's been abused by her husband, or any of these things. But the main principle that I'll wrap up with on this chapter, the two different ideas on page 122. One is that Rand says, look, a parent has a right to decide how his child should be educated. That is a right. So no matter, just leaving aside this question of like whether the child has some basic level of educational experience that he is entitled to receive from his parents, just like he's entitled to receive food and shelter and clothing. That's, obviously true. But there really should be no situation where the state is saying you cannot teach Islam to your children. You cannot teach Mormonism or evangelical Christianity to your children. And this is a point that I agree with Ayn Rand on, and I think that it's a point of potential disagreement between me and the theonomist school. So that's something to think about. Is this idea of freedom of thought a necessary part of a just society living as we do today in a secular society and a society that is not created by God, with no king installed by God, no specific rules given to us where God says you must form your society in this way? As Christians, we don't have any specific instructions from God that we should go create a Christian nation. And in the absence of that, it's a fundamental question we have to ask is, would our political agenda and program, ultimately, if we had our way, would it involve outlawing, teaching your kids Islam or Mormonism or any other religion? And I think that that will be helpful if we're going to have an honest discussion amongst those like myself who believe in liberty versus those who don't, such as the theonomists. The end of this page, page 122, Rand does say that she believes that divorce should be a legal option for women, especially if they've been physically abused in their marriage. And she points out that it's physical damage that is necessary. And that's interesting. I disagree with her that divorce should be an option, although I do believe there should be legal options for, for getting a restraining order or for legally separating from your husband. I don't believe that there should be legal divorces. But on that issue, even Moses allowed for divorces. So Christians would need to work out their vision and their program in the future if they were to come into political dominance about what should be the rules about divorce. This is another area where the theonomists and those who believe in liberty are probably going to end up disagreeing. So that's a summary of what was in that section from that chapter. And I'm going to wrap up by just offering some invitation to join on the discussion in the upcoming week. So I want to thank you for watching. I want to thank you for making sure to click like on YouTube and share this with other people if you found it useful, if you found it to be informative. And go to christianintellectual.com/Americanism. You can find all of our replays. So there will be 6 other ones plus today's. And eventually it's going to be 9 weeks. You can find it all there in that one page, and you can sign up if you'd like to come in on the webinar, if you'd like to leave comments live, if you'd like to join on video. It is not too late to join. We only have 2 more weeks, but you can join either one of those. It's informal. We are getting to know each other. We're building a foundation for future conferences where we may be presenting this worldview that is a Christian approach to political theology, and that is strongly influenced by the vision of the American Founding Fathers and some of the argumentation that we find in Ayn Rand. You can go to christianintellectual.com/subscribe to get on our email list. That will help you make sure you don't miss any of our updates. Thank you for joining today. I will see you next week at 9 a.m. Eastern. God bless.